Hey guys, we're here in Havana, Cuba, and today we kick off our series on the historic changes that are happening in the relationship between the United States and Cuba. We'll find out what young people have to say about it a little later on in the show. I'm Maggie Rulli, and Channel 1 News starts right now. What do you guys think about America?
Well, for me, America
it's very cool.
is amazing.
For some Cubans, traveling to America would be a dream.
I would like to live in America.
But not all Cubans feel the same way. In fact, some Cubans blame America for poor living conditions around their country.
Normally in Cuba, one would say the United States is like the bad guy.
But 15-year-old Denise Duarte feels differently.
The people of the United States really like Cuba.
She's been to the United States twice with her youth theater group La Colmenita, where she performed in New York City, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco.
It was really interesting because we could share our customs. We were able to dance and play together, all in one class with American kids.
But traveling to America is a trip that very few Cubans have been allowed to make because of restrictions put into place over half a century ago. And although Cuba is geographically close to the U.S., politically, the two countries could not be further apart. But that's changing.
Neither the American nor Cuban people are well served by a rigid policy that's rooted in events that took place before most of us were born.
In a historic moment earlier this month, President Barack Obama and Cuban President Raul Castro sat down together at a summit in Panama to discuss plans for the future.
We've been able to move forward in the resolution of some topics of mutual interest for both of our nations.
It followed a major announcement back in December when the two countries agreed to start talking to one another, reestablishing diplomatic ties. It was a huge step forward for two governments that have had little to no interaction for decades. But it also created a huge controversy. To understand why, we have to take you all the way back to the 1950s. It was during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union were embroiled in a dangerous arms race, and both countries had built up stockpiles of nuclear weapons. In the middle of this conflict between the two superpowers was the tiny nation in the Caribbean and its new leader, Fidel Castro. Castro came to power in 1959 when he overthrew Cuba's former leader in a revolution. He quickly created a communist government which seized most land and businesses, controlled the media, and limited the freedom of citizens. Castro also teamed up with America's communist rival, the Soviet Union. As a result, the U.S. ended their relationship with Cuba and passed a trade embargo, making it illegal for Americans to do business with Cuba, leaving behind a country that often looks frozen in time. Check out this car, total throwback, right? Well, it's not because they're retro. It's because America cut all ties with the country, and Cubans haven't been able to buy new cars or new car parts from America for the past 50 years. The U.S. also made several failed attempts to assassinate Castro, one of them known as the Bay of Pigs. But what Cuba did in response brought tensions between the two countries to a breaking point.
This government has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
In 1962, the CIA found out that Cuba had allowed the Soviet Union to bring nuclear bombs to the island within firing distance of the U.S. It began a standoff that became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. For a tense 13 days, Americans braced for war while the U.S. and Soviet Union negotiated the deal. And on October 28th, they finally agreed. Within 6 months, the Soviet weapons were gone. But while the Cuban Missile Crisis was over, Cuba's icy relationship with the United States had just begun. And the trade embargo is still in place today. You can find a McDonald's hamburger or Coca-Cola even in some of the most remote parts of the world. But because it's an American company, you're not going to find one here.
The embargo is something that affects us a lot, especially the young people, because we don't have the same opportunities as young people in other countries.
Most Cubans we've met have said the embargo is hurting the economy and hurting the people here. This sign shows an extreme view. It says the embargo is killing the country. During President Obama's speech last year, he announced that the United States would be opening up a U.S. embassy in the capital city of Havana and easing up on some business and travel restrictions.
If you've done the same thing for 50 years and nothing's changed, you should try something different if you want a different outcome.
But the trade embargo can only be lifted by Congress, and it doesn't look likely anytime soon. Denise Duarte loves being center stage. She sings, dances, and acts for one of the most prestigious theater groups in Cuba, called La Comunita.
I don't see it as a school. I see it more like a family.
Just a 15-minute bus ride from La Comunita is her home.
Hola.
She lives here in Havana with her parents, her sister, and her 2 dogs.
Here live my dad and my mom.
Like most Cubans in Havana, Denise and her family live modestly, a comfortable life, but one without a lot of luxuries. That's because Cuba is ruled by the Communist Party. The government controls most aspects of daily life, like how much money families will earn each month, where they can live, and even what they can watch or read. It's all part of a system put into place by Fidel Castro, who ruled the country for almost 50 years. In 1959, Fidel Castro, with the help of his brother Raúl, led a revolution and overthrew the Cuban government.
I believe the revolution happened because of a lot of bad governments that we had before. Bad economy, a lot of poverty, and the fact that the government did not take care of poor people at all.
Castro built a new communist government. The goal of communism is to take ownership of all of the land and resources and then spread wealth out evenly among society, in theory, minimizing the gap between the richest and poorest people. Castro's government seized control of over $25 billion of property and private businesses from the Cuban people. Many families lost everything.
My grandparents and my parents lost a lot, and I don't mean materially. I mean they lost a lot in terms of identity, in terms of their homeland.
Castro also began restricting people's freedoms. Cuba no longer held elections. The government prohibited the practice of religion and even limited other choices, like how much food you receive through government ration cards. So with the card, you get rice, sugar, chicken, fish, but if you want things outside of that, you go to the store and you buy them.
But it's better to buy it with a card because they have prices much lower than at the stores.
We just bought this pineapple for around 16 cents, which back in the States is next to nothing. But here in Cuba, where people live off just 20 bucks a month, pineapples can become a luxury. And luxuries are out of the question, as most Cubans have struggled just to put food on the table for decades. Even though we're just 90 miles apart, the U.S. cut off all ties with Cuba in 1961. U.S. companies were not allowed to do business here, meaning no buying or selling of goods, and travel was nearly impossible. It was all meant to punish the country by hurting its economy, and it's been the longest-standing embargo in modern history. This crippled the Cuban economy and left a food shortage across the country.
The fact that we cannot use dollars makes everything more expensive.
Those who spoke out against Fidel were quickly silenced through beatings, jail time, or even forced to leave the country. Thousands of Cubans began to flee. But some of Castro's changes did benefit the people of Cuba. He pushed to get equality for blacks and women on the island. He also made healthcare and public transportation free for all Cubans, and education became a top priority. Unlike American students, kids here in Cuba aren't worried about debt after college. That's because the government covers all their cost of education through a master's degree. This led to Cuba having one of the highest rates of literacy in the world, even higher than in the United States.
We don't have a good economy, we don't have many things to offer, but we have very prepared people. And that's very important because many countries with a better economy doesn't have as many doctors or as many professionals that we have.
For Denise, if being an entertainer doesn't work out, she plans on becoming an economist like her mom. And she says that even though the U.S. embargo on Cuba has hurt the country economically, the country will never be robbed of its rich culture.
Despite the fact that the embargo hasn't allowed our country to develop, it's a country that no matter how little we have, we share it with the world.
This is very expensive, okay? So when you get one of these in your hands, you must take good care of it.
Harold Cardenas is a political blogger in a country where only 5% of the people have access to the internet.
When you say blogger in Cuba, pretty much nobody knows what it is. You must explain to them. I'm a blogger, I write stuff in the internet. Ah, yes, the internet, that thing.
One internet card like this costs around $5 per hour for a slow, unreliable connection.
And $5 is what you earn in almost a week.
But Harold takes full advantage of his time as he writes about political issues on his blog La Joven Cuba, or The Young Cuba.
Cuba is changing very, very fastly, and Cubans, I think we don't appreciate how fast this is going because we're living inside.
Viva Cuba Libre!
In 2008, Fidel Castro became too sick to lead the country, so he handed over power to his brother Raul.
When Raul Castro went to power, when he became president, I was very skeptical.
But the new change in leadership led to some new changes in their day-to-day lives.
Instead of controlling everything, what is happening is what they are calling the new economic model. It's allowing private people to run small businesses.
So, while things like health, education, and food are still controlled by the government, Cubans are now being allowed to open up their own private businesses, as long as the government deems them to be non-essential. 20 years ago, a street like this would have never existed, but Cuba's gone through some changes over the past few years. And now, certain private businesses like restaurants, hair salons, and small shops are allowed to open. And although there's still no freedom of the press, the country has become a little more lenient on Cubans, like Harold, who have been critical of the government.
I think that we have much more freedom to say things and to write stuff right now than 10 years before. And that's very important. It's a huge accomplishment.
But still, Cuba ranks among the world's worst countries for freedom of speech. Fortunately, Cubans, who for years have had no means of communication to the outside world, are slowly gaining access. All right, let's go check it out. Okay. Harold took us to a part of town where young people hang out on weekends.
The young people hang out together and they share files, they share pictures, they take selfies. That is the new thing here.
Okay.
We're a little late.
They also share music from their favorite artists.
Nicki Minaj, Justin Bieber, Rihanna, Miley Cyrus.
Since internet speeds are so slow,
Conecta Bluetooth.
It's easier for people to download just one song, picture, or music video and then transfer them to friends over Bluetooth. And it's also a way for them to get around the government, which still regulates what they can and can't watch on TV. But as Cubans gain more and more freedoms, they can't help but crave more, something that will only be possible if the American embargo is lifted.
The Cubans relate much more to a country that is moving towards somewhere and that is changing than a country that is stuck in time.
All right, which pair do you think? When he's not in school,
I think these will look good on you.
Danny Gonzalez spends his time at his stepfather's shop, Optica Lopez.
What do you think?
It's what made him want to follow in the family business and one day become an optometrist to help people with their eyes. When he was 7, Danny left his home in Cuba for the United States and what he calls the land of opportunity.
In Cuba, I could study my whole life, be a lawyer, and earn the same as a guy who picks up tomatoes. And here I have the opportunity to study and make something for myself.
He found a home in Little Havana, a mostly Cuban neighborhood in Miami, Florida, where his stepfather owns his shop. Tell me about the store.
The store has been around since 1960. Yes. It was my stepdad's grandparents' store. He started it when he came from Cuba.
That was right after the end of the Cuban Revolution, when Fidel Castro took control of the country. His communist government seized private businesses, and thousands of Cubans began fleeing to the United States as exiles.
Being an exile is synonymous with being someone who has pain and carries a wound on their back.
So when President Obama announced that the U.S. would begin to normalize relations between the two countries, for some, it was a welcome change in policy that has stood for over 5 decades.
I think it's time to not move on, but give it a change. The United States would be a really big help for Cuba to develop.
But for others, opening communications did nothing but reopen those wounds from the past.
I don't want relations with Cuba unless Castro's leave.
While many of the young people we spoke with said they support the opening of relations between U.S. and Cuba, there's a big split between generations. Here in Little Havana, members of the older Cuban American community are against any type of relationship between the U.S. and Cuba. They say they remember what life was like under Fidel Castro and they don't want to go back.
Let's have relations, but let's have freedom. Free press, free political parties, free election. Obama is giving up everything and he's not demanding in return.
And that's the same message that Republican Senator Marco Rubio of Florida is trying to bring to Washington.
This president is the single worst negotiator we have had in the White House in my lifetime, who has basically given the Cuban government everything it asked for and received no assurances of any advances in democracy and freedom in return.
Some of the changes that President Obama has pushed through with his executive power are already bringing big changes to Cuba. Traveling there is easier now, though normal tourism for all Americans is still not allowed. Most people here on our flight are all going back to Cuba to visit family. When we were checking our bags, we noticed they had large flat-screen TVs, tons of electronics, huge packages, all bringing things back to their family in Cuba, things they can't get there because of the embargo. Major American companies, including MasterCard, Cisco, Marriott, Pepsi, Caterpillar, and Major League Baseball, have all shown interest in doing business in Cuba. In fact, the MLB recently announced a Grand Slam idea to play an exhibition game in Cuba by 2016. And now, more money can be sent to Cubans from the United States, up from $2,000 a year to $8,000. It's a huge increase to a practice that already brings in $2 billion a year, and will let many more Cubans start their own private businesses on the island.
So if you give somebody in Cuba the chance to establish a business, provide for their family in a dignified way, that makes them an owner of something, right? But also makes them an owner of their community. It makes them engaged in their society.
But that increase could also create a great divide. Other families who don't receive any of that money won't be able to advance, like in this poor neighborhood, El Fanguito, where very few people have family in the U.S. But despite the risks, many of the people in Cuba say they support the changes and hope to see even more of a relationship with the United States.
There is a Chinese proverb that says the hardest part about a long march is the first step, and I think we have taken the first step.
As Cuba continues to open up, there's still debate over what it all means for the future, but it's clear change is already hitting the country's shores. Maggie Rulli, Channel 1 News.